All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. We will get started here in about 5 minutes, so hang tight, and we will be starting at time at 10 o'clock. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar entitled Manure, Managing This Valuable Asset with Best Practices and Policy for Water Quality in Mind. My name is Gail Wint, and I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management, who is hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by my colleague, Dr. Thomas Green, President and co-founder of the IPM Institute, who will provide a brief introduction. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speakers. First, we will hear from Dr. Carrie Laboski, Professor of Soil Science and Soil Fertility Nutrient Management Extension Specialist at UW-Madison. Second, we will hear from Craig Scott, Director of Communications for Bion Environmental Technologies, Inc., a developer of advanced livestock waste treatment technology. At the end of presentations, we will use the remaining time for Q&A. Before we begin, I wanted to share some brief logistics. You will remain muted as an audience member during the presentations, but please make use of the question box on your screen to type questions for the speakers, and please indicate if the question is for Carrie or Craig. I will moderate the questions at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on partnershipfarm.org. By attending the webinar today, you will be eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 1 for manure management and 0.5 for nutrient management. You must be present for the entire 1-hour webinar to receive those points. If you are watching this webinar live, you will receive an email by the end of the day with the webinar recording and a link to submit survey evaluations. A link and pop-up question will be provided at the end of this webinar to submit CCA credentials to earn points. If you are watching this on demand, you are provided instructions at the end of this presentation to submit your credentials. And now, with those logistics taken care of, I will turn it over to Dr. Thomas Green.
Thanks, Gail, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It looks like we've got over 150 people participating, which is great. So, Partnership for Ag Resource Management is an effort of our nonprofit IPM Institute based here in Madison, along with a host of other projects in agriculture and in communities, each focused on using the power of the marketplace to improve sustainability. We're a team of 22 currently working to increase adoption of best practices and improve outcomes in health, environment, and economics, all key elements of sustainability. You may have read one or more of the IPM articles that we write regularly for Crops and Soils magazine. We also work with pest control companies, hospitals, schools, and other facilities and communities, and with food companies and farmers around the world to improve practices and communicate those benefits to buyers and the public. Our goal with the Partnership for Ag Resource Management is to identify revenue opportunities for ag retailers that also help keep our valuable ag resources on cropland, help promote those products and services, and track and report sales and estimated reductions in losses and nutrients and other inputs from cropland. Next slide, Gail. So we face a real challenge in the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River, Chesapeake Bay, and other watersheds. Nutrients and resources we need for our crops are leaving cropland and ending up in our rivers, lakes, and streams. Photos on the right show what happens when too much phosphorus gets in the water, feeding blooms of algae which close beaches to swimming, make fishing a challenge, and have also shut down public water supplies. The graph on the left shows NOAA annual data on algal bloom severity since 2002 in western Lake Erie. After phosphorus loadings declined sharply in the mid-'80s with the advent of reduced tillage, they've increased. And as a result, we've experienced more frequent and severe algal blooms. So 2015, the highest bar on that chart there was a record at 10.5 on the severity index, and exceeded the prior 2011 record. 2016 was 3.2, lower and lower than the 5.5 predicted. And these loads go up and down depending on rainfall amounts and the timing of the rainfall, but the trend has been for larger and larger blooms over the past 15 years. There are multiple sources of the phosphorus, but we know that phosphorus is coming primarily from cropland because of the timing of the loads. They spike during snow melt and rain events in winter and early spring following fall applications. The increase has been in dissolved phosphorus rather than phosphorus attached to soil particles, and along with that increase, Heidelberg University and others have documented a concentration of phosphorus in the top layer of soil, where years of surface applications in rotational no-till systems have resulted in saturation of the soil with phosphorus and an inability to hold more. As a consequence, we see this increased runoff plus movement down through macropores into and out tile drain systems. Next slide. So ag retailers have valuable products and services which can keep phosphorus on cropland and out of waterways. Here's a list of some of those, along with some very rough average reductions in phosphorus loss based on published studies. There's lots of variability in the published numbers based on soil type, slope, proximity to surface water, and management factors and other factors, but these rough averages give us a sense of where we can likely make a difference. So cover crops, soil testing, grid and zone sampling, and variable rate application, custom application are all revenue generating opportunities for ag retailers that also reduce phosphorus losses. We can also let farmers know when a broadcast application has been made so they can get out there and get the application covered. We can avoid applications before a heavy rain event, abide by setbacks, and let farmers know when we see an issue that needs attention in their fields, like a tile blowout, for example, that might increase losses. So applying only enough phosphorus for the following crop rather than the next several crops in the rotation can also make a difference. And today we'll hear from experts about strategies to manage phosphorus losses in manured fields. Next slide. So ag retailers are making a difference, and we're tracking that with our project. For example, our annual retailer survey shows big increases in variable rate phosphorus applications across the Great Lakes Basin. So if you look at the chart here, each bar represents a different year in our survey, and over time, sales of these revenue generating opportunities that also help us on the phosphorus side have been increasing. In 2015, we secured funding for ag retailers to offer a discount on variable rate to farmers in the Sandusky River watershed, and we had 13 retailers and 95 growers who had never used variable rate before participate. We expanded that program this past year to 3 additional watersheds in northwestern Ohio, and that accounts for some of the increase that you see here. And we know that farmers, once they try variable rate, they're very likely to continue to use it and expand its use on all of their acres. So using the published estimates from the previous slide, acres of BRT here alone represent more than 1 million pounds of phosphorus that's been prevented from leaving cropland in the watershed. We need to track and report these improvements that we're making so that regulators and the public are aware of these voluntary efforts using the power of the marketplace to drive improvements. You'll hear more from Gail about some additional tools and resources we have here to use as we work to achieve these goals. With that, I'd like to turn the mic back to Gail.
Thank you for that, Tom. As Tom mentioned, we do have some free resources available on our website, partnershipfarm.org. On the left, you can see the front page of our agronomist handbook that is available free for download. On the right, you can see the front and back of our phosphorus loss reduction wallet card, which can be ordered for free on our website as well. These serve as great conversation starters with your growers, and we have lots of people take them to their various meetings to hand out. To date, we have distributed 19,735 wallet cards, with 7,175 distributed so far for 2016. I also have a couple of PARM announcements before we get started. As Tom mentioned, Our 2016 Ag Retailer Survey is out, and a link to participate will be included in the follow-up emails. Our next webinar is in January. The date is still to be determined, but we will be discussing phosphorus stratification. Our February webinar will be on the topic of cover crop termination, and that will take place February 22nd, so mark your calendars for that. And last, we invite you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for PARM updates and industry news. After the webinar would be the perfect time to look us up for your computer or mobile device. Now at this time, we will hear from Dr. Carrie Laboski. Carrie is a professor of soil science and soil fertility nutrient management extension, University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Carrie, I will switch it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's warm. It's a cold day here in Madison. I just looked at the weather. It's -5 with wind chill. So if you're someplace warmer than that, good for you. So is my screen showing now, Gail?
It is. You just need to put it in presentation mode and you should be good. Yep, you're good to go, Carrie.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding manure phosphorus availability and some things surrounding that. So to get started, you know, if we think about using manure as a fertilizer, we really need to treat it like a fertilizer. We need to think about what's the nutrient composition of the manure, how are we applying it. We just can't treat it like shit, so to speak, and throw it out in the field. We need to be a little more precise about it. And so in order to properly credit nutrients from manure, we need to know a few things. We need to know the available nutrient content of the manure and also the application rate. And today I'm not going to talk about application rate. We're really going to focus on available nutrient content. One of the ways you can get at that would be the published book values that many universities and others put out for kind of average values for manure composition, or you have laboratory analysis. So the question is always, you know, to analyze or not to analyze. You know, what do you do? I'm a proponent of lab analysis, and I think you'll see why here. So this table is showing some of the variability in the composition of manure nutrients. And we have here on the left side, oops, I got to go back here. The left side, we have dairy manure, whether it's solid or liquid, and there's a swine liquid in here. We have our nutrient contents for N, P, and K. The columns here represent sampling that was done in Minnesota on 51 farms. You have the average concentration and the range. Wisconsin, this is an average of 746 liquid dairy samples, 414 liquid swine, and 799 semi-solid samples, so bigger sampling. And then the far right is the Midwest Plan Service document, what they have. So if we just look at this dairy liquid, for example, Minnesota, they have an average of 15 pounds per 1,000 gallons of total phosphate, a range from 6 to 28. But then here in Wisconsin, our sample, when this table was developed, we had an average of 9 with a standard deviation of 7, which is not uncommon to have these large standard deviations, and a range anywhere from 1 to 118. These are very big differences. And if we come down, look at swine manure here, liquid system, again, some very broad ranges. Minnesota, they're showing a range of anywhere from 3 to 64 pounds of phosphate per 1,000 gallons. Quite a bit different. Now I also want to show you some more detail for Wisconsin. And here I have, it's just for dairy manure. We have a lot of dairy manure in this state. And I have it further broken down. Instead of it just liquid and solid, I have it broken down into liquids that are less than 4% dry matter here, slurries, which we consider to be 4.1 to 11% dry matter, a semi-solid, which would be 11.1 to 20% dry matter, and then our solids, which would be over 20%. And you can see for any of these, I'm showing the mean. Okay, so that's the average value of all of our samples. And I want to point out at the bottom, this N, that's the number of samples that we had. And this is data from our soil and forage analysis lab over the time period of 2002 to 2013. And so we had a lot of samples going into this. The mean is on the top row. The median value, that's where 50% of the samples were greater than and 50% were less. In all cases runs a little bit lower, and that's pretty typical because high values can skew things. I also have here the 2.5 and 97.5 percentiles. And why I'm showing you that is that in between those percentiles, that range, it's capturing 95% of all the data. So I left out the far extremes, on the edges of the data set, because there's always some odd things. There are a few samples that come back 0 for phosphorus content, and that's just kind of odd. So we leave out those atypical outliers. But you can see for a dairy liquid, we can have anywhere from 0.3 to 12.1 pounds per 1,000 gallons. And a slurry system, so just a little bit more dry matter in there, we have higher concentrations of phosphate. Now I want to point out that if you were to think about applying 10,000 gallons per acre of a slurry manure, and it could range anywhere from 3.5 to 17.3 pounds per 1,000 gallons, that means your application of phosphorus could range from 35 to 173 pounds. And on average, if you took a book value, that would be saying maybe you had 9 or 10 pounds, or 90 or 100 pounds being applied. So there's some wide ranges, and this is why I think when you see data like this, it's a real reason to test manure. There's a good probability that you might be close to a median or a mean value for phosphate concentration, but there's also a pretty good probability you might be on one of the ends, either really high or really low. And especially if you're on a really high end and you're making some assumptions that you're more average, that means you're over-applying phosphorus. And that doesn't do us any good for crop production. It doesn't necessarily help us or hurt us, but environmentally that is a problem. So you're thinking about how to sample for manure. If you're going to test it, you got to sample it. So a great resource is this University of Wisconsin Extension publication. It's called Recommended Methods of Manure Analysis. It is extension publication A3769. And this is what the cover looks like. And if you're interested in it, just Google exactly this, UW Extension publication A3769. It's the first thing that comes up. Now, the title of this bulletin kind of is a misnomer. Or actually, it's a little misleading because it's saying recommended methods of manure analysis. And it is largely about manure analysis, but there's a section on manure sampling, which is really helpful. And so I pulled out some key information there. So if you're going to be sampling solid manures, you want to use one of the following methods, and it's probably not the one that's in this picture here. So you can sample while loading up your spreader. You take 5 composite samples, or you take 5 samples, composite them together, mix them thoroughly, and then fill a bag. You could also sample while you're spreading, and so in this case you maybe put tarps out in several places across the field to catch the manure. You want to then composite it, mix it, and fill your bag. A daily haul type situation, you might want to put a 5-gallon pail under the barn cleaner, mix it up, and fill a bag. You also then want to collect several samples over a period of time like that to get a better handle on what's happening. Now in the poultry situation, in these for in-house sampling, here you'd want to be collecting about 8 to 10 samples throughout the house to a depth that the litter will be removed. So if all the litter's going out, you can go right to the floor. If along the top part's going to get scraped out, just take that top area, mix it up, take a subsample. Now if you have stacked poultry manure somewhere, the house has been cleaned out and it's just been sitting. Now in this case you want to take about 10 samples, composite them together, and where you take these samples is you want to go around that pile and you want to get into the pile. You want to get about 18 inches deep, mix it, and take subsamples. This can be a little bit more challenging on sampling solid manures. It takes a little more effort. I think taking samples while you're spreading is probably one of the easier things to do. You do have to deal with a tarp that gets manure on it and spread it out, but from the standpoint of being able to collect manure as it's coming out of the spreader, you probably get a better sample. It's representative, because remember, when we're sampling, we're trying to achieve a representative sample. Now, if you're using a liquid manure system, you can do one of the following methods to sample. So from the storage aspect, you can agitate that pit, make sure it's agitated as thoroughly as possible, collect 5 samples, put them all in a 5-gallon pail. Now you have to agitate that 5-gallon pail to get it mixed up, because the solids start settling out pretty quick. A good way to do that is with a plunger. So just get a good old bathroom plunger and use it in the bucket, and then take a subsample and place it into a bottle. Now, another way of sampling liquid systems is during application. You can get a bucket or a pan, place it in the field. That would work obviously for surface applications, not so well if you've got an injection system. Now, another thing you can do would be to use a long ladle, a long-handled ladle. And that's what I've got shown here in the photo. We have this nice little stainless steel ladle. It's probably 1.5 liters, maybe almost 2 liters in volume on a long handle. And so you can get that underneath the injector. And this is what we do for research purposes all the time, and get that manure sample collected in the field. Now, when you take these samples, you do want to, again, put them in that 5-gallon pail, mix them up, and then use the plunger, and then take a subsample and put it in a bottle. Now, in the photo, I do show going right from the dipper into the bottle. And the reason for that just is really the fact that we have, this is research samples, and we're collecting a lot of samples compared to most folks. But that gets at variability and precision too, if you want to have more sampling. And also note on those bottles that those are wide mouth bottles. So now, once you've collected these samples, you're going to know how to handle them and what to do with them. So in the solid manure, what we want to do is use a 1-gallon Ziploc bag. Works great. Get those heavy-duty freezer bags, fill the bag about half full, squeeze out all the air, and seal it up tight. That works out really well. Now, for liquids, put it in a 1 quart or a 1 liter bottle, fill it about 3/4 full, and cap the bottle. It's really helpful for the labs if you use a wide mouth bottle. A narrow mouth bottle is more challenging, especially as the sample is frozen and it's thawing out. A wide mouth is good. I know that the UW Soil and Forage Analysis Lab, we often receive samples from folks that are reusing a Gatorade bottle. Those nice-sized Gatorade bottles tend to have a little bit wider mouth. Wash them out and reuse them that way. That works well. Now, for all types of manure, once you have the sample collected, if you're not going to take it to the lab immediately, please freeze it. Okay, so that stops all the reactions from happening in that sample, because there's bacteria, and they're going to keep going unless you can get them frozen. And keep it there until you ship it or deliver it to the lab. Now, if you're shipping to the lab, you want to make sure you ship early in the week, because you want to avoid delivery on a weekend or a holiday. Depending on the lab and how you ship it, it's possible that they might get a box of manure samples that have been frozen, but they show up on Saturday and nobody in the lab is there to receive them and do anything with it. They just come into an empty receiving room. So by the time they get there Monday morning, they're all thawed, and in some cases, they might be dripping all over the place. That's not very nice. So be thinking about that, because if you spent the time collecting the sample, you want to make sure the lab can actually analyze it. And the photo here is an example of something not to do. Here, they're pouring some liquid manure into a Ziploc bag. Please avoid doing that. That is very hard to handle in the lab when that thaws. Just think about it yourself. If you had a at home, if you had spaghetti sauce in a Ziploc bag, that's not necessarily the nicest thing to deal with when you start getting it thawed out and have to work with the sample. So now shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk more about the phosphorus availability in manure. And just to start off with, we need to keep in mind there are two forms of phosphorus in manure in a very broad sense. They are inorganic P that's soluble and organic forms of phosphorus that are slowly available. And if we look at broadly across the U.S. For land-grant universities, their guidance on the availability of phosphorus in manure, it'll run anywhere from about 60 to 100% of the total P is often considered available for crops. There's no set number per se, it's kind of a range. This has been the case for at least 2 decades now. And back in the early 2000s when I was working on my PhD, I started questioning where some of that number came from, this 60 to 80%. And there wasn't really a lot of good source or citation for it, just the general feeling that, well, maybe 60–80% of the total P in manure is in the form of inorganic, and therefore that's what would be available. So that bugged me a little bit that we didn't have some good information on that. So we set up some trials here when I got to Wisconsin, field trials, where we looked at the effect of a dairy slurry, a dairy semi-solid manure, a swine slurry, and a pelletized poultry litter. The effect of those manure applications on corn silage yield, okay? And we also looked at rate. So in this study we had anywhere from 0, 80, 160, or 240 pounds of total P applied per acre for each of those sources. And what we're seeing here in the graph is we did this at 2 locations, at our Arlington Ag Research Station and at Marshfield Ag Research Station. The maroon bar is Arlington, and here on the left side we have our sources of manure, and then we go all the way up to no manure was applied. And on the right we're looking at the effect of rate. So you're looking at the main effects of source versus the main effects of rate. And if we look at P source, and we use the fertilizer application as a comparison for how the crop did yield-wise with manure or with fertilizer, we can see that we had our silage yield here at this line coming across, and statistically there was no difference between any manure source and fertilizer. In fact, in one case, the dairy slurry, we actually got a little bit better yield out of that than what we did the fertilizer. If we look at Marshfield, the blue bars, there's no letters above them, so statistically there was no difference among the sources, whether it was fertilizer or any of the manure types. So the data is showing pretty clearly that we have that the P in manure is at least equally available to the crop as what fertilizer P is. And also looking at just the main effect of application rate, we can see that as we increased the application rate, we increased yield significantly at Arlington, and at Marshfield it was not significant. General trend was an increase, but it wasn't significant. So we saw no difference between phosphorus source at either location with regard to yield. In 2006, we followed up in those same plots to look at a second-year manure credit, and we found that there was no difference between sources as well. So there really wasn't a second-year end credit at all. But if we think about from a first-year credit, we can assume 100% is available and none in the second-year application. Now, one thing I don't have any tables or figures for is we did a lot of soil sampling in this study prior to any manure application and then later in the fall to see how soil test levels changed. And we did find that manure P changed soil test levels differently than fertilizer. And we thought that was really kind of interesting. If the yields were the same, but the soil test levels were a little different, and they did different things. It wasn't the exact same amount of change in soil test P, whether it was at Arlington or Marshfield. There were some differences by location. So with that, we wanted to follow up and understand more of how soil manure application affects soil test P levels. And here we have what I'm going to talk about is phosphorus buffering capacity. And this is really the amount of phosphorus per acre required to raise soil test level 1 part per million. Okay, so the bigger the number we're going to see, it's the more phosphorus is required to raise soil tests from a particular source. Now, for just background's sake, UW, we currently assume for medium and fine textured soils it takes 18 pounds per acre of phosphorus to increase soil test 1 part per million. And on our coarse textured soils, that would be 12 pounds per acre to increase soil test 1 part per million. Now this 18 pounds per acre for medium and fine textured soils, that's also used in a number of states in the Midwest. I'm not sure how broadly it is used outside of the Midwest as well, but that gives you an idea. So what we saw in some work that we did with the same soil at Arlington and Marshfield, and then we had manure applications applied. You can see that here's our phosphorus buffer capacity. And we have, for fertilizer, it was 13.1. Now note, 18 is what we would typically have assumed for this soil. But we saw no significant difference in any of the manure sources compared to fertilizer. And if we looked at the Marshfield site, we also saw no significant differences in P sources with regard to their phosphorus buffer capacity. This is field-based data. And we do see a range that Marshfield had significantly greater P buffer capacity than Arlington, meaning that we needed to apply more P at Marshfield to increase soil test 1 part per million compared to Arlington. Now we followed this up with some lab incubations with these manures and fertilizers and found similar things to what we had here in the field. There was a little bit more control because it was laboratory settings, so we could say some things with more clarity. But that then led to some other things that's really interesting to think about. Well, what about manure treatment? How does that affect soil test phosphorus level? If we know that we've got some differences between locations, say Arlington and Marshfield, between those soils, and there's maybe some differences between manure sources on soil test P, what happens when we throw in the treatment effect? Now by treatment, what I'm talking about here is any manipulation of the manure. So it could be just a simple liquid-solid separator, like a screw press, and then the liquids are going on the field, and maybe the solids are getting put to some other purpose. They may or may not go on the field. It could be an anaerobic digester that has a liquid-solid separation system. There's some centrifugal separation systems, and even if you think about a composting, whether it's hauling it out of the barn and composting system, or there are here in the Midwest at least some of these in-barn composting type systems for dairy manures. So that was the next thing to think about. And so we did this in a lab where we can control things a little bit better and we don't have to worry about the weather messing things up. We chose 5 typical agricultural soils from Wisconsin. One was a little bit sandier, the other 4 were silt loams. We had 18 dairy manures from 5 different farms. 2 of the farms had an anaerobic digester with the liquid-solid separator. One had a mechanical liquid-solid separator, one had a centrifugal liquid-solid separator, and one was this bedded pack compost, so that would be an in-barn system. Each manure was applied to the soil at 183 pounds of total phosphate per acre at an equivalent rate. We did have one manure that was highly liquid that we couldn't put, and the concentration of P was relatively low, and we just couldn't put that much, we couldn't put 183 on. It was too wet, so it was only 73, but we did account for that in how we dealt with the data. And we did a 10-week incubation in the lab. And we measured both Bray 1 phosphorus and the soil P buffer capacity. And just to give you an example of what we did, here we have these small cups of soil, and this is the correct amount of manure that was weighed out. This looks like it's one of the composted systems that was here. It would have been kept moist, and then we had put a lid on the container with some holes and kept it warm and happy for 10 weeks and measured soil test levels. And so what did we find? Okay, so this is a measure of this P buffer capacity. And so this is the increase in soil test by 1 part per million. How many pounds per acre was required to increase soil test 1 part per million? So the top row is showing fertilizer for the 5 different soils that we used. And they're all a little bit different, and none of them was exactly 18. But we're not going to get too concerned about that, because this was a lab study where we had things mixed really well. Now, we have one farm here called Farm 5. This farm was raw, digested, had raw manure. We had some digested manure that we collected before it went through a liquid solid separator. Then we had a digested separated liquid and digested separated solid. Now, Farm 3, this was the centrifugal separator. So we had a raw sample. This produced 2 liquid separated materials, one called concentrate, the other called tea water. But you don't want to drink that tip of tea water. And then the third was a separated solid off of that. So if we look specifically within one farm type, and oops, I'm having trouble here, my mouse is misbehaving. One farm type and one soil, we have all these letters, and that's showing our statistics. So samples with the same letter, for example, this 17 and 15 both have A's, they're not different than each other. And here these both have B's, they're not different from each other. But the A and B would be different from each other. So just showing you how the statistics came out. Anything that has an asterisk by it means that it was significantly different than the P buffer capacity for fertilizer on that soil. So here, on this way more soil for these 2 farms with these different manure treatments, only Farm 3 separated solids had a P buffer capacity that was different than fertilizer. Though we did see some significant differences between the source of P, how that treatment process may have affected P buffer capacity. And if we look at across all of them on the Dodgeville soil, interestingly enough, we had more differences amongst manure treatment than what we did on others. For example, say the Hortonville, there was no differences between manure treatment on any farm with regard to P buffer capacity. And a couple places here on Farm 5, that P buffer capacity was significantly different than fertilizer. So it's really kind of interesting showing that there's a big difference between soil type and manure, and even, manure isn't manure, so you get one farm versus another farm, but even the system that's used for treatment can behave very differently between soils and locations. Just example between Dodgeville and Hortonville. But a key thing is the asterisks are showing where it's different than fertilizer, and see there's only on here relatively few asterisks, meaning it's different than that fertilizer treatment. So conclusions from that lab study is that these P buffer capacities are generally greater than fertilizer, but it's only significant less than 30% of the comparison, so not really all that often. Therefore, I think it's really best to assume that manure total P is going to increase soil test level as much as fertilizer, but it might take a little bit more manure P to raise soil test levels. Okay, so it could be a little bit more, but we have to assume it's probably similar to fertilizer. And to kind of just give an overall summary of manure P availability in general, manure P is as available as fertilizer when it's applied on a total P basis when we think about crop production. And this is something that's been an eye-opener for some folks as I've presented this data over the last 10 years or so, because there's a lot of assumptions that, it's just not, manure is just not that good of a fertilizer, but it is a great fertilizer for pea. We do need to keep in mind that manure pea availability estimates from land-grant universities do vary somewhat. I don't know if anybody's still using anything as low as 60%. There probably is, all the way up to 100%. And this makes sense. Here in Wisconsin, we use 80% available. Even though I just showed you all the research we did that say manure pea is really 100% available, it's doing its job. So the 80%, why we use that is because, manure is not a uniform source. It can be variable, and the application is often not uniform. So to account for some variability in source and application, we take down the availability to only 80%. We don't want to under-apply P if a crop is going to need it. Now, there are cases where some universities are using or suggesting 100% availability, and I think that's only occurring if soil test P levels in general exceed a certain threshold to begin with. And, both soil type and manure type affect how much soil test P levels are going to change when manure is applied. That's really interesting, I think. And we did some follow-up work with a graduate student I had to try and understand that more, and it's related to clay content in the soil, organic matter, enzymatic breakdown of organic P compounds in manure. And the key here really is soil sample on a regular basis. That's really going to be our best way to monitor changes in soil test P, and then we can figure out how to adjust our management practices if needed. If we see that soil test P levels are building up a little bit more than what we'd like, and we're in a sensitive area environmentally for runoff, then we need to say, well, we need to change some things and get those soil test Ps down a little bit. But we also maybe find that we're not building up soil test level quite as much as what we were expecting, and maybe we don't try to load it up, but we say, okay, this is our management practice is doing a good job. And so with that, I just will hold questions till later, but I'd just like to acknowledge that some of the research that I presented had been funded by the Wisconsin Fertilizer Research Program and a Hatch grant. Thanks.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Carrie. So at this time, we're going to switch it over to Craig Scott. As I said, Craig is the Director of Communications for Bion Environmental Technologies.
Hi, Gail. I'm guessing because I got a bunch of blanks, you were breaking up there, that I'm live.
Yes, you are live. I can hear you, and your screen is good, so you're good to go.
All right, good deal. First, I'd like to thank Tom and Carrie. I just hope that what I have to share is as helpful as what I've just learned, because I'm going to take it up about 30,000 feet, and we're going to talk about some of the advances in technology, some of the changes in policy, and how the private sector is being engaged. First of all, my name is Craig Scott. I am the Director of Communications for Bion Environmental Technologies. In fair disclosure, we are a livestock waste treatment resource recovery company. We've been developing technology now for about 25 years. We've got about $100 million invested in our technology platform. It works. We are a small public company. We've got about 1,600 shareholders across the United States. If anybody would like to contact me after the presentation, my email address is below. Before I get started, I wanted to comment on a couple things that are not in the presentation that I think need to be addressed. Because we're focused on the Chesapeake Bay, where this is mostly about nitrogen removal to the bay and the cost to remove that nitrogen. I'm going to speak more from a nitrogen perspective, but understand the technologies that we deal with are just as focused on dealing with phosphorus. And frankly, I can't agree with Dr. Laboski more with respect to manure nutrient composition, and particularly her preference for lab analysis over values from the book. And I don't want to start this off by being the private sector heretic, but as we have found, the book is not always right. And in fact, with respect to nitrogen, it is quite wrong. And we'll talk about how wrong it is and what we've learned over the last few years in the Chesapeake Bay. Again, our technology platform is a large CAFO solution. We are not a small farm solution, at least not at the present time. Our technology is based on a process train of mechanical, biological, and thermal processes. And just so you know, this is not an advertisement for Bion. I think it's important that you guys understand my perspective, though. We do offer a similar level of treatment to municipal wastewater treatment plants. We have real-time monitoring and verification of our processes. And really what we're focused on is separating out the nitrogen and phosphorus so that they can then be used independently of each other. We have a second generation of technology that's been proven at commercial scale. It's a dairy treatment system on a 1,200 milker facility at the Kreider Farms Dairy in Manheim, Pennsylvania, on the Susquehanna River, obviously a large contributor to the Chesapeake Bay problem. The Pennsylvania DEP has issued a full water quality permit. As far as we know, it's the only full water quality permit that's been issued to a farm in the U.S. Our nutrient credit verification plan has been approved under the DEP's EPA-approved verification plan. And we have last year conducted a USDA technical assessment that qualified our technology under the technical assessment program for federal loan guarantees. As the US EPA refers to Bion, we are a non-point source with a permit. And it's really a relatively new designation that they are just learning how to deal with. If you take a look at this slide, we are also a member, again, part of full disclosure, we are also a member of the Coalition for Affordable Bay Solutions. That web address is there. The CABS is an advocacy group that was established to implement competitive bidding in the Chesapeake Bay, starting in Pennsylvania, to acquire low-cost nutrient reductions from the private sector. This is a program that is designed to engage the private sector to bring its technology and innovation into this problem and come up with some low-cost solutions. Essentially, competitive bidding will bring access to taxpayer and ratepayer funding that is not available today. The founding members of CABS are ourselves, Bion, JBS USA, which the parent is JBS SA, the largest beef and pork producer in the world. Kreider Farms, which not only has the dairy, but is also the third largest egg producer in the country, with about a little under 6 million laying birds in 4 locations. Then Fair Oaks Farms, you guys may be familiar with, that's Mike McCluskey in Indiana, one of the largest and what we consider one of the most advanced showcase farms in the country. The Chesapeake Bay is really the most studied watershed in the United States. I suspect the Great Lakes are right behind it, but a bay-wide total maximum daily load, that's the pollution diet, was implemented in the Bay in 2009. If I'm insulting your intelligence with some of this, I just have to apologize. You have to understand I am normally giving presentations to investment banking groups, and these people generally have no idea where their food or their water comes from. So don't be upset if you think I am insulting that intelligence. The key to the TMDL is to reduce nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment to the bay. Again, we're going to focus on nitrogen here. The interim target in 2017, next year, is 41 million pounds of nitrogen, and by 2025 to reduce 68 million pounds. That TMDL was challenged at the Supreme Court by a number of states, attorneys generals from several states, mostly in the Mississippi River Basin. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear that challenge in 2016. And frankly, prior to the election, it was widely speculated that similar rules would be implemented soon in the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Basin. I think that may be open for debate now with the election, but we'll see how that plays out. Back to the Bay, the total restoration cost estimates using our current strategies range anywhere from $30 to $50 billion. Obviously, the cost to clean up the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Basin are going to be considerably higher. And while we have watershed implementation plans from Delaware, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and New York, what we're going to primarily focus on here is Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania's problem is primarily agriculture, and they are way, way behind. So they are looking for solutions to improve that position. As far as the Chesapeake Bay mandate is concerned, Pennsylvania, back in 2009 when the mandate was implemented, was required to reduce 38 million pounds, which is, over half of the total obligation. And of that 38 million pounds, agriculture was responsible for 27 million. Now, this is just kind of a factoid I find somewhat ironic, but Pennsylvania has spent about 80% of the Bay funding that they've devoted to, to the Bay on their point sources, while in fact the non-point sources account for about 70% of the nutrient load, and from my perspective it's not hard to figure out why they're so far behind. If you look at their progress, these are numbers right off of the EPA website. In 2009, again, they were looking at a delivered load of about 62 million pounds. In 2015, they were looking at about 100,000 pounds more. So they've really gone backwards. Their 2017 interim target is 46 million pounds. They are about 16 million pounds behind. They're in default. They've admitted they're in default. And the EPA has placed them on backstop actions level, which is the highest level of oversight, both in the agriculture and stormwater sectors. They are facing real sanctions in 2017 in the form of fines, withholding of federal funds, and by the way, EPA has already done that, so they've got their attention. They're looking at withholding permits, and they're looking at some stormwater mandates that could be billions of dollars in cost. So again, Pennsylvania is now highly motivated to find solutions that cost less. It's just that simple. And one of the things that they've landed on is credit trading. Credit trading, point source to point source, is a fairly accepted practice. However, what we're looking at is non-point source to point source trading. And that is a different animal. And in order to be a qualified offset, or to take that non-point source credit and offset these TMDL requirements, those credits are going to have to be verified. And this is some new stuff that you guys in the Midwest may not have heard about this yet, but the US EPA is now applying an uncertainty factor to best management practices in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And that uncertainty factor is at least 1 for 2, which means you're going to take a 50% haircut on what they thought they had before. Again, there's some links to the technical memorandums from the US EPA, as well as the STAC study that led to this uncertainty factor. Just so you know, Pennsylvania has actually adopted a 1 for 3 uncertainty factor. So they've haircutted them by about 66%. So far, this only applies to the Chesapeake Bay. More importantly, if you have measured reductions, and these reductions are measured under an approved verification plan, they are not subject to an uncertainty factor. Again, think non-point source with a permit like Bion, where we can actually measure these reductions. We get full credit for them without an uncertainty factor. And then all of those credits, whether they're BMPs or measured reductions, are then subject to the traditional edge of segment and delivery ratios to the Bay and banking factors. Now, this is kind of off this train, but I think it's important to talk about these edge of segment and delivery ratio calculations and the new Sparrow model that's out there. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. You probably are. It's just being implemented in Pennsylvania, but it provides substantially greater accuracy in modeling. Pennsylvania, for example, used to be broken up into 64 segments, and if you wound up in that segment, it didn't matter how far away from the Susquehanna you were, you had the same edge of segment factor. The Sparrow model will make this much, much more accurate and more relevant, and will really help drive better decision making when these guys are trying to figure out how to spend their money. For example, it'll identify those sources that have a very low edge of segment factor and that will benefit the most from cleanup. And more importantly, from a private sector perspective, it will also properly credit that mitigation to the benefit of both Pennsylvania as well as those that actually do the work and will receive those credits. And from the private sector's perspective, which is how we're looking to get paid, that's a very important point. Clearly, I'm not telling you guys anything you don't already know, but these CAFOs are the greatest opportunity for improvement. Obviously, scale plus concentration equals the opportunity for cost-effective technology solutions. And this is where we're going to talk about the fact that the book is wrong. Because what we have found in the Chesapeake Bay is that ammonia is really the key driver here. Ammonia emissions and the subsequent atmospheric deposition of that nitrogen from livestock waste has been greatly underestimated. We can see below the notification from the Office of Inspector General of the U.S. EPA. They're onto this too. There has definitely been a missing link in the nitrogen calculation in the Chesapeake Bay, and I suspect everywhere in the United States. In a life cycle analysis at the Kreider Dairy, and understand we're using a mass balance, nitrogen in, nitrogen out. We found on average that, first of all, 365 pounds per nitrogen per cow per day is voided per ASABE and the PSU agronomy guide. What we found is that 100 pounds, actually a little more than 100 pounds, is lost in the first 24 hours due to volatilization of ammonia. Another 100 pounds is lost over the next several months from the lagoon, also as ammonia. And then of what's left and what's land applied, about 100 pounds is lost through leaching and further ammonia volatilization. That's an 80% loss on a per cow basis. And frankly, we have calculated similar results in an analysis at a California dairy farm, and our discussions with other large dairy farmers have essentially confirmed what we have found. And what we find even more interesting is that the EPA is starting to change its attitude as well towards nitrogen and the ammonia emissions. This slide that's up here right now was loaded right out yesterday out of the Chesapeake Bay Progress. That website web address is right there. But what I want you to pay attention to is the gray area and what they're calling forest/non-tidal water atmospheric deposition. Just 6 months ago, this category, which accounts for about 22% of nitrogen, was just forest. And frankly, we all know that forests don't emit nitrogen. That nitrogen had to be coming from somewhere. And what they are finding is that, not just what Bion has found, but now we have studies that are confirming it, is that the nitrogen is coming from these ammonia emissions, and clearly the livestock industry is responsible for the majority of those ammonia emissions. A CSU study, Colorado State University, was published in May of this year. It was in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Again, the link to that study is there, led by CSU's Department of Atmospheric Science, collaborators from several offices in EPA, National Park Service, and National Atmospheric Deposition Program. You can read that conclusion as well as I can. There is no doubt in our minds and in those that are studying the ammonia emission issue closely that the vast majority of livestock waste impacts with nitrogen are coming from these ammonia emissions. And you're going to see more and more of that as time goes on. So, in talking about some of these technologies, there's a lot of them out there. I really can't speak in any detail about a lot of these other technologies, but you essentially have the takeaway here that the technologies are there. You will see more and more technologies as the policy framework that we're about to talk to is implemented, and that the takeaway here is that over time the supply of raw manure will begin to decrease and be replaced by better quality, stable fertilizer products that are extracted from the manure waste stream. Nutrient LLC is a group that was organized by the dairy industry to advance manure technologies, practices, products, and markets for the dairy industry. It's primarily focused on closing the loop on phosphorus, and right now they're evaluating about 160 technologies. I spoke with their CEO this morning. They expect the catalog to be published sometime in the first quarter of 2017. They are just getting some feedback from some of these technology providers to make sure that they've got the data right. But you can see that study. Their website is www.nutrient.com. Obviously, Nutrient is spelled N-E-W. But you can follow that, and I think sometime probably in February is when you'll see that catalog come out. A lot of different technologies ranging in, from small farm solutions that are relatively low cost, low technology, all the way up to technologies like Bion, which are a clearly a large-scale solution and very technology-oriented. So policy change is really the key driver here. Everyone, including the livestock industry, agrees that livestock production is one of the largest sources of pollution in the United States. It's really no longer a question of if it gets cleaned up. It's a question of how does it get accomplished and how does it get paid for. The industry is at the table here, understand. And as far as how it gets accomplished, we really only have two choices. We can increase the regulation, which we all know is going to be a long and very bloody battle. The other option is to incentivize voluntary reductions along the lines of what we do today. What we need to do is focus on CAFOs where we get the greatest return on investment. You have that concentration, you have that scale, you have the cost-effective impacts of that scale and concentration. Market-driven solutions will engage the industry, it will engage the private sector on the technology side, and as I said, the industry is ready and willing to be engaged. The technologies are ready. Certainly they're going to improve over time, but there are technologies like Bion's that are ready today. What we need is a combination of policy changes to help offset those technology adoption costs. And we're going to start with the U.S. Energy Tax Credit Bill. The Agriculture Environmental Stewardship Act of 2016, House Bill 5489, was introduced this year. It was introduced to extend the biogas credit to 2020, but more importantly, it will extend that tax credit to nutrient recovery technologies and projects. That's a 30% investment tax credit that will reduce project costs by 30%. It also provides a tax-free bonding authority. The bill has bipartisan support, has 30 co-sponsors, of which 19 are Republicans, 11 are Democrats. They're from across the United States. It has very strong livestock industry support. Excuse me. And understand, this is the same energy tax credit that drove growth in the wind and solar and biofuels industries. And while I don't think anybody can make any firm predictions on what's going to happen under the Trump administration, clearly the message is out there that market-driven solutions are going to be favored over regulatory solutions. I don't think there's any surprise there. As far as how else we're going to pay for it, we're going to have to create greater value from the waste stream. Clearly the application of raw manure when you're losing 80% of its nitrogen value is not the most efficient practice out there. Now again, I can only really speak from Bion's perspective, but our business model includes revenues or value creation from 4 distinct categories. One is the production of value-added byproducts. We can extract nitrogen from the livestock waste stream. We can extract it in the form of ammonium bicarbonate, which is a stable nitrogen source that everybody's familiar with, and that's really a new ability that I don't think has been out there, and it's important to understand that if we can separate the nitrogen and the phosphorus, it can now be applied independently of each other. We're also looking at some feed additive opportunities. Those are out there in the future. There's no doubt that they're there. It's a question of cost and efficiency. We are going to extract renewable energy. There's no secret there as far as anaerobic digestion goes. The key is that with sufficient scale, we can actually condition that natural gas that we produce into pipeline quality. And if we've got a pipeline nearby, we can inject it into that pipeline. If we've got an interconnect with California, we can create a tremendous amount of value by using that biogas as a renewable transportation fuel. It is then subject to a number of renewable energy and carbon credits that substantially increase the value over just the native value of the gas. Another thing that because we are verifying these reductions, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the pathogen kill, all the other, the greenhouse gas reductions, all the other things that are being verified for these various state and federal regulatory agencies, we can provide that data to the producer in the form of a USDA process verified program brand, a sustainable brand, something that the industry is clearly trying to get to. They've kind of been fumbling around with it so far. We can actually provide that data backbone today that can demonstrate a reduced nitrogen footprint, a reduced carbon footprint, and that pathogen kill. And the last one is the nutrient reduction credits, and that's kind of the tricky one. This is an evolving issue. If you look at Pennsylvania, again, trading is not so off the wall here, but what we're looking for is an actual procurement strategy. We're looking to change the existing sector allocation strategy that essentially blindly assigns reductions to various categories, whether it's municipal waste treatment or industry or stormwater or septic. Unfortunately, that ignores costs and efficiencies. And if we can supplement it with a procurement strategy that will engage the private sector technology and capital and get that innovation in there to reduce costs. These verified, the fact that we now have a verified credit standard enables these credits to be essentially a commodity. Think paper clips, and commodities or services that are acquired on behalf of the taxpayer are generally acquired through competitive bidding, because competitive bidding brings transparency, it brings accountability to the process. More importantly, by engaging the private sector to provide solutions and to provide results, we're going to transfer the risk away from the taxpayer and put it on the private sector. Because what the private sector is going to sell, if you will, to the state and its taxpayers are going to be verified results. The taxpayer is not going to fund these projects. The taxpayer is not going to take the risk of these projects and the potential for uncertain outcomes and performance. So competitive bidding we're not looking to replace sector allocation, we're looking to supplement it. And the only way you're going to get the private sector to come in and provide these types of solutions and to take that capital risk is if you have a strategy that provides certainty through these types of accepted procurement processes. Competitive bidding is coming. There's no question about it. I was at the Pennsylvania Senate Joint Committee hearing here on October 18th on the Chesapeake Bay strategies. All of the major stakeholders presented their case, if you will. This was a joint committee hearing between Ag and Rural Affairs and Environmental Resources and Energy. And the consensus was really pretty simple. A, we need to spend more money, which was pretty clear, but more importantly, we've got to place a greater emphasis on return on investment. We've got to get a better bang for our buck on our investment dollars in solving these problems. You've got to define where the low-cost solutions are, and competitive bidding will do that. And as a matter of fact, legislation has been introduced in Pennsylvania on October 26th, about 3 days before the session closed. You've got Senate Bill 1401, the Water Quality Improvement Act, was introduced in the Pennsylvania Senate Environmental Resources and Energy Committee. To give you an idea of how strongly this bill is supported, the actual sponsor of the bill was Jake Corman, who is the Senate Majority Leader. Jake Corman does not sponsor very many bills, and when he does, there's a message there. This is a very large priority for the legislature when it goes back into session in January. I think if you'll notice that this type of legislation has generally been sponsored by Republicans. Republicans have increased their majority in the Senate and the House, and we feel very, very strongly that this legislation will pass. There was a 2013 bipartisan Pennsylvania legislative study that said clearly that competitive bidding could save Pennsylvania taxpayers up to 80% of their annual compliance costs. That's $1.5 billion a year. Not only will this provide for competitive bidding, it will provide a sustainable funding source that will be there every year, which is what is required by the private sector to fund these ongoing purchases of credits, which will then allow them to finance these large-scale technology solution projects. Again, the Assembly is back in session at the end of January. We're very certain that legislation is going to pass. Pennsylvania is essentially between a rock and a hard place with respect to the Bay. And frankly, we believe that you are seeing the beginning of a new national clean water strategy that does engage the private sector and expands clean water from being a strictly government and non-government organization controlled enterprise to one that takes value and gets to the low-cost solution regardless of its source. and regardless of who produces it, whether it comes from a farm, whether it comes from a non-point source, whether it comes from a point source. There's a better way to do things. Frankly, our Clean Water Act was passed, as we all know, in 1972. Times have changed. Farms have gotten larger, technology's gotten better, and we need to give the private sector a chance to innovate here. So, you know, again, this was intended to be kind of a 30,000-foot view. Gail, I'm pretty much done, so I guess you can cut me off and open this thing up for questions. Am I the only one here?
All right, Craig, thank you so much for that. And thank you both for taking the time out to share with us today. We do have a couple of minutes available for Q&A. So if you could enter your questions into the question box on your screen, and please let me know who the question is for. Our first question is for Carrie, and it is, why is the phosphorus value so variable even within the same type of manure sources?
Okay, that's a great question that I should have covered. The reason we see that, so like within, say, dairy slurry, why we see large variability is there's a lot of differences on farms. So we first start with feed. Not everybody's feeding the same ration, so that's going to cause some differences. And then manure handling and storage are a lot, especially when we start thinking about pits and open pits and the size of the pits. Is it a rainy year versus a dry year? That can make a big difference in how much dilution occurs in that pit. But so largely between the feeding ration and then also the handling is what causes that big difference.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Carrie. We have a question for Craig. Why are ammonia emissions higher now than 50 years ago? Are there that many more animals in the U.S. now?
I don't know that they're, I don't know that they're that much higher, and frankly, I don't know that the populations have increased that much. I'm not a historian, but what I think the issue here is the fact that it just was not recognized. I don't think that the amount of ammonia emissions was recognized, and I don't think their impacts were recognized. I really think that's the issue.
Okay, perfect. We have another question, I'm assuming for Craig. Where are other states on new legislation, and do you think that the current programs such as the 4R program and programs like ours are enough?
First of all, I don't think you're not seeing any legislation in other states yet. The Chesapeake Bay and Pennsylvania are unique in that, A, that there is a TMDL, a watershed-wide TMDL in Pennsylvania, or for the Chesapeake Bay, of which Pennsylvania is a part of. So there's a hammer, if you will. As far as the 4Rs, no, I don't think it's enough, and the reason I don't think it's enough is again because of these ammonia emissions from livestock, that really the only way to deal with these ammonia emissions is to cut them off at the source, and I don't see any way to do that economically other than to get to the very large-scale farms that are out there where you have that scale and concentration and you have the opportunity to shut those ammonia emissions off cost effectively.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Craig. We had time for about one more question. So this one will be for Carrie. Does the phosphorus value of manure change much over time for the same source? So for example, cows that have stopped grazing over the winter.
Okay, yes, the phosphorus concentration can change. So if there's been a change in the ration, that could cause a change. So if you have, especially cows that have been summer grazed and now they're on ration in the winter, there may be some differences there. Typically, what has been found when sampling's been done, on a regular basis with manures at a particular farm, is that over a period of time, maybe it's 3 years, 2 to 4 years, depending on how frequently it's sampled, if there have been no large changes in the diet and also no large changes in how manure is handled within that farm, then they can the farms can sort of have a bit of an idea of what their baseline is, and it's going to wiggle. It's not going to be identical every time, but they'll have an idea of where they're at. But anytime you implement a change in diet, that could cause some changes, or differences between how much the animal's in or out in their feeding, between partially grazed during the year.
All right, awesome. Well, in the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A. So I want to thank both Dr. Laboski and Craig for joining us today. I think you both shared some really fantastic and beneficial information for us all. This time, I want to recognize our participating ag retailers. If you're an ag retailer in the Great Lakes Basin that is interested in participating in this partnership to benefit your business and water quality, please contact me. As we wrap up, please remember to look for the email later this afternoon with a webinar evaluation, webinar recording, and a link to submit your CCA credentials to earn the 1.5 CCA CEUs. I want to thank you all again for joining us today. If you have questions for any of us, feel free to email myself or the presenters. Just make sure that you reference the PARM webinar when you are emailing. And I hope you all have a safe and joyous holiday. Thank you.